Welcome to this second episode of this cycle of podcasts dedicated to service fields. And this month, in the sign of Taurus, we will be focusing on our capacities of true observation and the recognition of reality. Last month, we focused on the dynamic and energetic sign of Aries and the field of politics. And now we come to the sensual and spiritual path of Taurus. Taurus is an intriguing sign because it is one of the most spiritually enlightening signs of all. It is the role of Taurus to transcend the material into the spiritual, to go beyond what we see, feel, touch in the concrete world, and see things on a higher level. So today we will reflect on what it means to work on developing a clear vision that can be maintained through all events, no matter how challenging, and which is constant across space and time. We will also consider how that relates to developing and applying intuition. The wisdom teachings speak to us of collaborators trained to work on the emotional or astral plane in order to break through those ideas and emotions that hold us captive in an unreal perception of self and others, and thus allow the inflow of light to humanity. There are a growing number of individuals who, often in group formation, operate through a more intuitive ability to grasp the causes of what is happening, not letting themselves be influenced by emotional suggestions stimulated by ancient and deceptive thought forms. I'm delighted that today we are joined by Michael Lindfield, the president of Meditation Mount in Ojai, California, who will help us to navigate this topic and come to a deeper and clearer understanding of what it means to use our higher powers of observation and come into a new understanding and recognition of what is real. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Lorraine. Nice to be here.
And thank you so much for being with us today for this important subject at such a challenging time in our world. As you know, our theme is building our capacity of observation to be able to see reality. So can I start with the word reality? How would you help us to understand this idea more fully?
Well, you've got the easy questions first. What is reality? Actually, your introductory remarks prompted an insight. If I'm looking at the largest possible grasp I can have of reality, I would say reality is the precipitated structure and geometry of consciousness projected from the mind of God into the fields of time and space. Now that's a very high-level statement. We as humans are still growing in our capacity to perceive and to really see clearly. And because we have free will, we've created conditions that are not always the clearest. And one of the spiritual maxims that we're very aware of is that energy follows thought, that we create our own realities based on our conditioning, based on our perceptions and beliefs of the world. So our world is colored by our biases and prejudices. And I was thinking, it's like a lot of young people now who spend many, many hours inside of video games. You could say that our modern day society does resemble like a giant video game that we've programmed ourselves. And then in recent years, those of us who've been to the movies are sort of amazed by the special effects, because you see on the screen something that isn't real, but they've managed to create this reality through computer-generated images, CGI. I think what we have in our world at the moment, in the big game of life that all of us are playing inside, our reality is often created by what I would say astral or emotionally generated images. So they are the projections from our own desires. They are the projections of our best ability to be clear, which in fact is a distortion. And so what we've created around us is not the clearest environment. And I would say that our temporary reality within the human experience does not reflect the deeper reality held within the heart and mind of the Creator. And it's bridging that gap. It's removing those distortions. It's seeing clearly, being able to act clearly, that is the task that lies ahead.
Yes, thank you. So what I'm taking from that is that we have that capacity to see more clearly, to get beyond some of the projections that you described, those emotional images. But we're going to have to strive for that. We have to work for that.
Yes.
We have to put ourselves into a new place. And it's also clear, I think, to all of us that there are many events happening in our world today that are incredibly challenging, and we're kind of connecting with those on the level of effects. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how we might be able to see a higher level of understanding. How do we reach a higher level of understanding about what is actually causing those effects? So we know in the analogy you gave us that those computer-generated images are the result of some coding and some intention and some design on the part of the technician. But how do we come to a new perspective? What sort of practices, what sort of things might we want to do that would help us get to that place?
Before I respond to that specifically, let me go back to the astral plane, because often when we name something called the astral plane, people have negative connotations around it, they have negative images. In fact, I'd like to put in a good word for the astral plane. The astral plane in its own right has its own quality of light. It is a frequency band of luminosity. And here's the rub. Most of our humanity lives its life focused in the emotional and lower mental realms, and therefore like attracts like. So the astral plane is where we take up residence. This is the main house in which humanity dwells. This is where we've lived over the eons, and we've created our dwelling there. So we've occupied the astral plane. And as we said, energy follows thought. So with each negative emotion or separative thought, we've released what I would call colors, chemical compounds into the environment. We've polluted the astral plane with our expressions and excretions. And if you look inside our house, whether that be the house of our individual lives or the planet, we've actually created a major ecological disaster seen from the psychoenergetic perspective. So cleaning up the astral and lower mental planes is an urgent task facing us. So I would say that the first thing to do is the cleanup process of our own emotions and our own lower mental so that we can see clearly, because it's an act of liberation. It will liberate us from the gravitational pull and hold of the emotions, and it will allow us to refine our frequencies so that we can take up residence in our new home, our appointed home, which is the abode of the heart.
That's interesting, because what's coming to mind as you're speaking is almost this idea of a magnet, that we're attracting more of the same if we stay in the same place of this kind of perhaps more distorted emotional space. And so as we look at the news on any given day, we can see those events as reinforcing our worldview on an emotional level and feel that pain and so on.
Yes.
Or as we clean up our act, as you described it, we may start to see something higher, something new, something different, not because the events are right, but because there's a new pattern somewhere in that.
Yes. I also want to make a distinction between feeling and emotions. Mm. Because feeling is this sensitivity you talk about, that we can be in touch with the world. That was something that you named in the introduction there. It helps us to be in touch with the world. If I'm in touch with the world and then suddenly something unresolved and unredeemed from my past gets triggered emotionally, I immediately have an emotional overlay, and my feelings become really expressions of an emotional pattern. If we can work through our emotional addiction, and if we can liberate ourselves from the astral plane or from the emotional magnet that is binding us to Earth, we will then have a pure feeling body that can sense and touch, but not get triggered and held in place on the earth. So this is the liberation. This is what the Tibetan teacher talks about, freeing the prisoners of the planet. And another image came to mind as you were speaking. I was thinking of Agni Yoga, the Agni Yoga teachings. And I came across a passage there a couple of years ago where it said, well, here in the ashram, here where we dwell in the abode of the masters, we have feelings. Feelings give richness. They are the memories we have of our work together over many lifetimes. They add color and richness. They're different from emotional attachment. And another thing that we know from Agni Yoga is that it is the fire that burns through all of this, because water is associated with the astral plane. You talked about moving from the astral to the intuitive. Well, we know that the intuitive plane is the air, the Buddhic. And I was thinking of a reference in the Bible where it says, though we see through a glass darkly. And it's as though inside this emotional state, inside this astral house in which we currently dwell as humanity, we see through a glass darkly. And it's the seeing with the eyes of the heart, which is the phrase from Agni Yoga. When we see with the eyes of the heart, we see through a more of a clear crystal lens, which is the loving heart. It's a prejudice-free mind. So that's really what we are working to, we're aspiring to, raise our frequencies. When we raise our frequency, then naturally we create a reality around us that corresponds to that frequency. And the closer we come to the frequency that is held in the heart and mind of God, the Creator, the closer we come to creating reality, heaven on earth, and raising her earth to heaven. But we're faced with this huge, huge task of cleaning up this toxic wasteland called the emotional and lower mental planes of our human psyche.
Well, and I think what we're seeing at this point in time is a lot of that unpleasant, that's too mild a word, but that some of those extreme impacts that I guess in many ways are healthily being viewed and giving us the opportunity to clean them. But it does feel like a really difficult time in human evolution, I think, for many people. Yes. And as we separate feeling from emotion, but you know, even the most developed or strong amongst us might be forgiven for thinking this is a really, really tough time that we're living through at the moment. How can we be more useful in these times, even allowing for the fact that we've got our own cleanup to do, but this larger cleanup can feel really overwhelming at times?
We have to start with the personal cleanup, because that creates a space in which we can stand more clearly and more securely to do the work. To the degree that I am free from emotional triggering, then I can stand in the world, I can register the pain and the suffering, but it doesn't throw me off center. What it does, it opens my heart, it expands my capacity to embrace. They say that one can truly only love until the heart is broken. And I believe our collective heart of humanity at the moment is being broken. It's incredibly painful. And yet we're seeing signs of love, compassion, just flowing out from people at the same time as we just are just wondering, what's going on? How do we stop this? It seems as though it's almost an impossible task to stop. So the first thing for us to do is to stop ourselves, enter the silence, enter the stillness, take a good look at our interior world, see what needs addressing, see what needs cleaning up, and then step in as a compassionate warrior, and join with others as a force for good and do whatever we can. The tricky thing, you said that the emotional plane is very tricky. It sort of pulls people down. It's like quicksand. The other tricky plane is the lower mental, the plane of beliefs. I know I catch myself all the time thinking, well, I'm free of prejudice, free of belief, and I suddenly find myself standing in a place that is judging what's happening on the planet through a particular point of view. And when that point of view becomes crystallized as an opinion, I become opinionated, and I don't hold all the possibilities, and I cannot hold a synthetic worldview. And so it is very difficult to extricate ourselves from the polarities of the emotional and lower mental plane. And that is the task. And that's where we're caught in as a society at the moment. We see the polarization. There's religious, there's political, there's every possible variation on the theme. And yet the solution is loving kindness, opening the heart. And opening the heart means we open ourselves to registering more pain, which can trigger all the unredeemed and unpleasant things in the world. And yet, at some point, we have to face that personal shadow, because at the moment, we are facing the collective shadow. And the degree to which we can affect that collective shadow is the degree to which we've liberated and brought light into our own world. So this is the energy of Taurus, bringing light from heaven to earth, anchoring it. So we see with that single eye of God, which is, and when the eye is single, then the body is full of light. We know that text, but it is probably the toughest task and situation we've ever faced as a humanity. And we're facing it together because we know what's happening around the world 24/7. So it is a collective challenge that we are facing.
Yeah, you describe it so powerfully, and that anchoring ourselves in the heart feels to me like really, really powerful, a powerful reminder and a powerful advice. Within this, of course, if we stay with our concept of being able to see more clearly and to take ourselves to that new reality, we will start to think about the future. We'll start to think about, inevitably we want to have a sense of not just when will this end, but what would that future look like? And I guess it's down to us to take some responsibility for looking to and visualizing that new future. And I'm wondering whether you have some thoughts on how do we actually start to facilitate that? Because, sometimes it can feel a little bit hopeless or overly hopeful to be thinking about a future, and yet we're creative beings. So how do we balance that, cleaning up our mental and emotional backyard, but also keeping our eye on envisioning a new future?
Thank you. That's a great question. In fact, it's a really important question, because often we just look at survival. How do we get through this? How do we survive? If we don't plant new seeds of new possibilities, nothing will change. And that's the one thing that the community of living ethics has in common with Meditation Mount. We are here to promote creative meditation, which is the ability to create the living memes of a desired future. It's like being a spiritual architect, and we create the new forms and we package them energetically as seed thoughts, and then we launch those seed thoughts out into the ethers so that they can land in the consciousness of humanity and take root and start to germinate and eventually flower as a new society. But we have to start with planting the seeds. But you can't plant seeds on stony ground. If I plant these seeds and place them on rocky ground, nothing's going to grow. So we have to do this dual task, creating the vision of the future, creating the seed thoughts, the memes of the preferred world, at the same time as we have to create the right psychic soil conditions that can receive the seeds. And those psychic soil conditions really are best created through loving kindness, through compassion, through tolerance, all the things that are the qualities of the soul. And there's one important one that people don't often speak about in this time of suffering, and that's joy. Joy is an incredible power. I remember Dr. Roberto Assagioli, who we know because he was like the inspiration behind Meditation Mountain, also behind the Community of Living Ethics. And he was the founder of that spiritual psychology we know as psychosynthesis. He was a great proponent of creative meditation, but his keynote in life was joy. And I pick up on a word you said earlier, Lorraine, striving. I would say that joyful striving is what it's about. Because joy, if you like, puts air under our spiritual wings on the path. It allows us to break free of this gravitational pull of the pain. And so it helps. And I'm thinking of the words of the Master Jesus, be in the world, but not of it. So it doesn't mean we have to escape from the world, but we have to be in it, but not be affected by it so that we're disabled. It can't be debilitating to the point where we're frozen with fear, we're incapacitated. We have to have the ability to hold the pain of the world in our heart, and then with the imagination and with cooperation with the other dimensions of the body of Earth, we are here to precipitate the future in the present. And that future we're seeking to precipitate is this, if you like, the reality that lives in the mind of God. Some people call it the divine plan.
Yes, and we know, when we look to the natural creations, the natural existence, the natural world, just how beautiful, how fabulously beautiful that creation is in the physical form, and we can only imagine how beautiful it is in the sense of our feelings and our connection with each other and our relationships. We may have the good fortune to experience some of that in our lives today, hopefully most of us. So we've covered a lot of ground very quickly, and we're coming to the end of our time here and on this brief podcast. But I wanted to see, without trying to put you on the spot too much, whether there's a sort of summary or a concise sentence or even just a piece of advice that you might want to leave our listeners with in this field of being able to shift our powers of vision, to see things, see reality through a new lens, to find our way forward in these challenging but powerful times. Is there something that you would like to leave our listeners with at this point?
The thing that reassures me is when I feel in my bones the truth of the statement that I and we are fractals of the one life. And I go back to that wonderful statement from the Bhagavad Gita, having pervaded the universe with a fragment of myself, I remain. So each one of us carries inside our heart, inside our being, the one. We are representatives of the one. So what I would invite people to do is realize that we are representing the one every moment. And what we are doing is seeking to embody the one, which is that path of self-realization. Self-realization isn't just Michael gets realized. Self-realization is when life realizes itself through us, and we expand our awareness and our consciousness to a greater state of wholeness to embrace more of this deeper reality held in the heart and mind of the Creator. So it would be to allow us to stand in a more, what would I say, expansive space of spirit. Stand in our own sovereignty knowing that our sovereignty is an expression of the greater sovereignty of the one life. And that puts everything into perspective. And we're told by the Tibetan teacher that we should have humility. Humility doesn't mean we're meek and timid. Humility is an adjusted sense of right proportion. So that's the other thing I would leave our listeners with. Humility as an adjusted sense of right proportion means that I don't aggrandize myself and try to make myself more than what I am, but I don't belittle myself and I don't diminish myself. I've got to find, if you like, that sweet spot of sovereignty that I can stand in to do the work with others, to become the force for good, become that band of sisters and brothers that carry the torch of fiery hope into a darkened world. I know it sounds very prosaic, but for me, that's the task. And I hold these perspectives in order to be able to get up each day and deal with the pain that is being broadcast from the news and being broadcast around the emotional network that is our common feeling body of humanity. So that was a long answer. It wasn't a concise sentence of do this. I would, if you want a concise sentence, I'd say, open your heart, receive the love of the one life, and allow that love to flow to others and become part of this great chain of blessing, the great circulation of the one thing that you can count on in life, which is the presence of love. Because that is the reason, the pre-existing condition that gave birth to everything. At the heart of who we are, our essence, is love. But that love needs to be born, and it's born in the cave of the human heart.
Thank you, Michael. Beautiful. And through that love, we are able to see more clearly and connect with the true reality of what life is through us and in us.
Yes. Instead of living a light-hearted existence, which can seem frivolous, we now live a heart-lighted existence, which sees clearly and holds everything in love.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, this has been very powerful and I hope very insightful for our listeners. And I thank you very much for joining us today, Michael. I'm sure we'll be connecting back with you at some later stage in the cycle of our podcast. But for now, I'd like to thank you very much. Thank our listeners for taking time to be with us. And we look forward to joining you for the next podcast in the next month. But for now, goodbye. Thank you. This podcast was offered by the Community of Living Ethics, Umbria, Italy, and freely inspired by Aldebaran, the community's Astrosophy group, and by our research on service.